Well, I've always wanted to make movies, for as long as I can remember. And growing up, it never occurred to me that people actually made movies. I thought they were like, descended from heaven or something. And then when I started college here, instead of studying English and math and all that, I was going over to the library and looking up all these movies about, or books about filmmaking. And there's one book in particular called Independent Filmmaking by Lenny Lipton. And that was where I was introduced to the whole concept of independent filmmaking. And I'd never realized and thought about the idea that someone could just get the equipment and make a movie. I thought you had to, go to Hollywood and get hired and have a career there. And so from then on, I decided that's what I wanted to do.
All right, were there movies that you saw, like, kind of in that were like, oh, I can do this? Like, what are the movies that you made you think, okay, this is attainable?
Well, yeah, I mean, for a long time, I really, watched a lot of low-budget indie films, especially really low-budget horrors, and a lot of very obscure stuff. And then, weirdly, it was really big-budget movies that inspired me to try and make my own. So, like before I made Bloodsucker's Planet, I was watching Prometheus. And for some bizarre reason, I was watching that huge, massive, epic film and thought, yeah, I should try to do that. Well, I guess the basic thing I would say is Bryan College Station is actually a really good place to make movies. I've never approached a business and asked to use them as a location and been turned down, ever. Getting into people's homes is actually much harder, which is strange, but that's what I've found. But, there's not a lot of movie making going on here, and so if you approach someone about it, it's like very exciting. It's something unusual. And when we made Bloodsucker's Handbook, there's a scene that we shot at Martin's Barbecue. And so I went and talked to them and explained what I was doing and asked when I could go and what would be a really slow time for them. And they said, well, we don't get a lot of business on Monday evenings. And so we scheduled to shoot then. And when I arrived there was a sign on the door that said, closed for private function. They had actually shut down the restaurant for us. Didn't tell us they were going to do that. They just did it. And on top of that, they fed us. But in general, the business people here are very welcoming. And so I have friends who wanted to pursue filmmaking from here that actually, some years ago, I had like this circle of filmmaker friends, and all of them moved away to Austin, and with the intention of pursuing film careers, and none of them succeeded. It was just, they got there, and it was too difficult and too big, and there's too much industry, and they take it too seriously, and so they had a hard time with it. Some of them moved to other cities and then started making movies again. But the ones that stayed in Austin, it just didn't work out. So, yeah, I think this is a really good place. Well, one thing is, I do almost everything. So I write it, I do the camera work, I do the editing, I do the animation, um, make the props and the costumes. And so every step of the way, everything is all, intertwined. So as I'm writing the script, I'm also thinking about what kind of place could I shoot this in. And as I'm shooting, I'm thinking about how I'm going to edit these together, and what angles I need to do. And because I know that, then I know how to light it, because it's like the very best place to put a light when you're setting up a scene is like just barely out of frame. And so if you know how you're editing, you can plan ahead and figure out where that spot is going to be. So like sometimes I'll shoot for other people, other directors, and I'm the cinematographer. And it's always much more difficult for me to do that, because they, a lot of times, don't necessarily know where they want to put the camera, which is a real basic question for anyone that's setting up lights. So it's all very integrated, and I'm usually thinking about music too as I start writing the script. And yeah.
Yeah, so it's, you don't view it as like a writer, director, editor. You view it as just one big filmmaker position.
Yeah. I think basically a film by
Okay.
covers what I do.
All right.
In my previous films, I was putting like written, directed, edited, and animated by, and then I started feeling stupid doing that, because I was claiming so many different positions. So on this one, I made up some pseudonyms so that there would be other people in the credits. More resources from one to the next. The budgets are amazingly similar. Every one of them has cost $5,000. And there's a very specific reason for that, and it's not because of what are the needs of the movie and what do I need in order to tell the story. It's because $5,000 is how much money I can squirrel away without triggering an audit from my wife. And so that's the amount of money I have to work with, and that's what I do. I am hoping to have a bigger budget next time around.
I mean, this looks more expensive than a $5,000 movie.
Yeah.
That's like really nice.
Yeah, that's because I had access to the studio space. That made a big difference. Previously, I'd never really made sets except for a little bit with Bloodsucker's Planet. We built a spaceship interior set in my parents' living room,
Okay, I think I remember
which stayed there for 9 months. But they were very supportive. Okay. So I did those in kind of two different ways. The destruction of the castle, the castle was a model that I built. And it started out as a Victorian dollhouse, and then I kit bashed it to make it look like an abbey. And for the destruction part, what I did is I took the model and I laid it down on the flat so that the front of it's facing up. And then I put a bunch of loose bricks. Those were actually sheets of cork that I cut into brick shapes. And I animated those. And so if you watch it falling apart, it kind of looks like they're crawling down the side. That's because they actually were sitting on the surface of it. And then so I had this line of these fake bricks that I animated moving down, and I had a sheet of green screen material that I pushed along behind it to cover up the part of the building that was disappearing, and then I worked my way down from there. For the stop animation,
Oh, okay.
I actually brought some visual aids. So this is the snail, and it's there's a wire armature underneath, and let's see, and then it's like pillow foam underneath, and that's an actual shell I got at Hobby Lobby, and then it's covered with stocking material. I bought some stockings and cut them up, and that's what I would use for the skin, and then paint over that. Let's see.
Are these only the stop motion creatures for this
Yeah,
specific
yeah.
movie?
These are the actual stop motion puppets that I made. There's the rabbit, and again, it's a wire armature covered with pillow foam, and then I glued crepe hair over it. And yeah. Oh, there's the abbess when she got taken away by the balloon. So I made these various puppets, and I used a program called Dragon Frame. I don't, if anyone's familiar with it.
You can kind of check back like your previous frames. If you
Yeah, it's kind of the standard stop motion software.
I was hoping you had the little dog from Bloodsucker's Handbook in there. That's,
Oh, no, it's actually fallen apart.
that's what I was worried you were going to say.
Yeah, that one I didn't make myself. There's a guy in Sweden who's a pretty well-known stop animator. He's actually an amateur, but he's really famous. And he has a private YouTube channel where he shows his process and gives demonstrations of how he's building his stuff. And so I contacted him and asked if he would be willing to make some for me, and he agreed, and so he built them and shipped them to me from Sweden. But the wire armatures aren't very rugged, and so in the course of animating that, I broke every single joint on the puppet and had to go in and try to repair it. And then as I was going along, I worked my way from the wider shots with the full body to these closer shots, and as I got closer and it was falling apart, I ended up like pulling off the bottom half of it and just connecting it to a stand in order to hold it still. So it's kind of in pieces. Yeah, none of these are very rugged. They really don't last much beyond the filming. Well, there were a whole bunch of different inspirations. The basic idea of the story that the music of the spheres is holding the planets in place, and that's what keeps everything in harmony, was an idea I had when I was a freshman in college, and was introduced to that concept in my English class. And at the time I thought, well, what if someone came up with a really, really terrible noise that would disrupt all of that and would cause the music of the spheres to get corrupted, and then the planets would be out of sync, and it would cause terrible things to happen on Earth. But I could never think of a way of actually showing that. And then just in the last few years, as I started thinking about this one, I revisited that idea and kind of came up with an idea of how to show that. So that was one of the inspirations. The other one is, I mentioned Suspiria. There's a lot of inspiration from that. The overall basic story, I think, is actually pretty much the same as Suspiria. You know, the idea of someone being taken to this institution that turns out to be run by witches, and then she has to have it out with them. And then the look and the style came from Haxan, the silent horror. So those are the basic inspirations for it. And then the stop animation was inspired by Jan Svakmeyer. He's I think he's Czech. Was Czech. I could be wrong. I'm not really sure of his nationality, but he was an Eastern European animator. He made a film of Alice in Wonderland. It's just called Alice in the 70s or 80s. And so that was kind of what I was shooting for the stop motion rabbit. And then along with all of that, there was just the general concept of Marginalia, which, if you start looking at it, you know, the medieval manuscripts, they would put these decorations and stuff. The scribes would draw little cartoons and stuff in the margins, and they were really bizarre. And so one of the recurring themes was killer rabbits. And so if you look at this, you see a lot of art of these rabbits killing knights. And then killer snails was another recurring theme. And lots of penises, you know, hanging from trees or you know, that you can ride on. It was very bizarre. So those were the inspirations. So the three movies that you're familiar with, those aren't actually all of the movies I've made.
Okay.
There were a couple ones before that were less successful. But going back to those early ones, the very first one's the only one where I ever had auditions for, when I was just starting out. And I had a really hard time finding actors. And then I approached Wanda Desa, who was the director of Stage Center. She was actually a founder of it. And I explained what I needed, and she said, okay, well, just give me a list of what kind of characters you need. And 24 hours later, she had my cast lined up. And so from that group, I just started meeting actors, and they had friends who were actors. And so over the years, I've just gotten this kind of core group of actors that I always just assume those are the people that are going to be in it. And they used to all be local. They've moved away, and so like when I made Marginalia, actually all of the major characters were played by actors that had to come in from out of town, and in some cases out of state. But they were all part of this group that started out right here. And then, so those are the people that get all the major parts, and then they have friends who are actors, or they introduce me to other people that fill out the rest of the roles. Let's see. The collapsing building was pretty difficult. And it took me a long time to figure out how to do it, because I originally wanted to actually make a model that would collapse, but I just couldn't figure out how. So figuring that out and getting it done was really difficult. There weren't really specific scenes that were more difficult than others, but there were certain challenges. And one of them was uh, there was a miscommunication with the owner of the studio. And so when I told him what the start date of the film was, he thought I meant that was when I was going to start building the set. And I actually meant that's when I was going to start shooting. And so we got closer and closer to time to shoot. And I'd go and say, well, you know, we're getting close to time to shoot or time to start the movie. And he'd say, well, yeah, that's great. And I never could schedule time to get in and start working on it. And finally, about a week and a half before we were supposed to start shooting, I said, I really need to start working on this set. And that was when I found out that he didn't realize what the date was. And so we ended up having a little over a week to build the entire set. And so we had to scale it down a lot. It was originally going to be much bigger and much more grandiose. And as it happened, we were working on the set right up until we began shooting. And so, you know, actors were coming in and they had to stay away from the walls because the paint was still wet. And I mentioned that they were coming in from out of town, so there was a very specific time period when I could shoot with them because they all had to go back to wherever they had to go. And so it had to be finished in that time frame. And so there was a lot of stress around that. I had a hard time with costumes. Yeah, I had arranged for someone to be the costume designer, and then very close to time to start, she had to back out, and so I ended up doing them myself. Let's see. Those were probably the biggest challenges.
Any questions?
Well, we had a 10-day shoot, and then after that, there were some pickups, a few weekends that took place, I guess, over the next 6 months or so, just very sporadically. But for the most part, the actual shooting was very short, and which is actually the way pretty much all of my films go. The shoots are fast, but the post-production is slow. And so the entire process took about 2 years. Oh, music was another real challenge, because the people that I'd tried to get to do the soundtrack ended up having to back out, and so I kept going to all of my musician composer friends, and for some reason or another, none of them were able to do it, and so it ended up being something that I had to do myself, and so there was a learning curve there, because that's really not something that I normally do. Yeah, it actually had to do with the set. And so my original concept was that it was going to be this bright, colorful Hammer Studios type of look. And right up until, actually even after we started shooting, that was what I had in mind. But because the set wasn't really finished off, a lot of the elements of the set looked really bad in color. But I found that if I was looking at it in black and white, things like where it wasn't painted all the way to the bottom, in black and white it just looks like texture. In color you can tell it's just that it's not finished. So I decided to switch and go with the silent film aesthetic, which, as I was preparing, I kind of like went back and forth. Do I want it to be like a 60s looking movie, or do I want to make it a 20s looking movie? And I couldn't decide, and I finally landed on I'm going to make it in color, because I don't want people to think I only do black and white films. But then I ended up doing it in black and white. The other reason, so the set was a problem, and then also the demon makeup. We used latex body paint, and as shooting progressed, it stopped adhering to his skin, and he started getting rips in it. And so in color, that was a lot more noticeable. And so, that was the other thing that kind of pushed me over the edge to stick with black and white.